formation.
A tearing sound ripped through the air, descending on the Alaskan military island United States. The shockwave blasted everything, pulverizing the harbor before the ear could even register the sound of the devastating explosion. Shipping containers were torn open, scattered like dry leaves. Warships snapped in two, sinking into a sea of fire. Spreading oil ignited, turning the water's surface into a crimson hell-black smoke, rising to blot out the sky. In seconds, the island became a catastrophe. On the coast of Chukotka, Russia initiated a large-scale weapons test. On the coastal launchers, the newest Zircon missiles were raised, their warheads gleaming. Radar tracking systems and specialized vehicles crowded the test site. This was a demonstration intended to prove the strength of Moscow's military technology. The first enormous missile ignited, roaring into the sky, leaving a bright red trail of fire. Tracking radar showed a stable flight path. All eyes watched in anticipation, but unusual signals appeared. The flight path deviated from its trajectory. Instead of heading out to sea, it veered south, straight toward the American military center. With no time for a warning, the Alaskan military island took the full force of this ferocious missile. A national military alert was immediately activated, just like we turn on notifications and subscribe to the channel so we don't miss any details of today's situation. A horrific explosion shook the entire island. The missile slammed directly into the harbor area. The blast tore the ground open, creating a massive crater. On the docks, rows of warehouses collapsed. Metal roofing flying everywhere, steel frames buckling, triggering a series of chain reaction explosions from a secondary ammo depot. The scene devolved into a nightmare. Sailors were thrown into the sea. Many vanished into the inferno. Rescue helicopters appeared, but the thick smoke and flames made any approach nearly impossible. The column of black smoke rose hundreds of meters, visible from the Russian coast from the American mainland. Monitoring systems recorded the entire event. The terrible explosion, the collapse of the harbor. Casualty figures were immediately reported as heavy and uncontrollable. But behind this disaster, a chain reaction was triggered. The warning systems of the US, Japanese, and South Korean alliance lit up simultaneously, treating the event as an emergency signal. In Tokyo and Seoul, defense command centers flashed red alerts. In the Pacific, US radar signaled an anomaly, and from the Pentagon, a vague encrypted order was issued. No one knew its contents, only that all forces in the region were to immediately elevate their combat readiness status. The mistaken strike on the American harbor not only created a sea of fire and blood, but also became an invisible lure, dragging the entire alliance into a vortex from which none could escape. America's automated defense systems reverse-tracked the trajectory, identifying the launch point within Russian territory in Chukotka. Without waiting for orders, coastal launch batteries opened fire simultaneously. Red streaks ripped across the sky. Dozens of retaliatory missiles launched straight toward Russia, raining fire down on the very base that had just launched on the Chukotka mainland. A series of violent explosions erupted. A fuel depot ignited, a radar station collapsed. Numerous technical facilities were destroyed. Coastal residents panicked, scrambling into shelters as the horizon lit up with crimson flashes. Both sides of the strait were engulfed in smoke and fire. On one side, the American military port was devastated, ships, sunk soldiers suffering heavy casualties. On the other, the Chukotka base burned furiously. Its military infrastructure shattered. At sea, Russian warships began cutting through the waves, their radar sweeping intensely. On the American side, frigates and submarines scrambled from their remaining ports. In the air bases, fighter jet engines roared, pilots readying for takeoff. A failed weapons test had transformed into the opening shot of a full-scale confrontation between the two shores. In the Pacific, US radar signaled an anomaly, and from the Pentagon, a vague encrypted order was issued. No one knew its contents, only that all forces in the region were to immediately elevate their combat readiness status. The mistaken strike on the American harbor not only created a sea of fire and blood, but also became an invisible lure, dragging the entire alliance into a vortex from which none could escape. Violent explosions shook the Chukotka coast. A fuel depot burst into flames, a radar station toppled many technical control centers, shattered fire erupting spectacularly, black smoke blanketing the entire coastal region. A chain reaction spread through the Russian military. An emergency alert blared system-wide, and the Northern Fleet was immediately ordered to leave port. Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates, heavy cruisers, and amphibious assault ships charged into the sea, forming a line tens of kilometers long. From the deck of the aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov-Su, 33 fighters launched one by one, roaring like iron beasts, piercing the sky. The American warning systems switched to the highest red alert status. Coastal radar reverse-tracked the trajectory, clearly identifying the missile launch point from Chukotka. All automated response protocols activated. Coastal launchers roared in unison. One by one, surface-to-surface missiles left their tubes bright red flames tearing across the sky. The overlapping white smoke trails created a deadly fireworks display aimed straight at the mainland. Responding from the American shore, coastal artillery opened fire. Shells flew like fiery javelins landing near the enemy ship's hulls. The waters of the strait, normally bustling with commercial shipping, had transformed into a deadly exclusion zone. Hundreds of merchant ships hastily changed course. Seaports issued emergency closures. Millions of civilians watched live on their screens, their hearts pounding. Moscow immediately issued a statement, claiming the U.S. fired first, that this provocation would be punished. Meanwhile, Washington broadcast the opposite. A Russian missile struck the military port. We were only defending ourselves. Two conflicting narratives, but the reality on the battlefield had already surpassed diplomacy. At sea, radar registered a series of new signals. Groups of Su-57 Felon fighters flew low, using the terrain for cover. An American AWACS plane broadcast a signal calling for interceptors. The narrow space of the strait made all movement extremely dangerous. A deviation of just a few kilometers meant straying into the enemy's kill zone. The situation escalated. Russian admirals ordered their forces to approach the median line, shattering the fragile equilibrium. The U.S. responded by deploying submarines, hiding beneath the waves, torpedoes ready. From both shores, everything moved. The Russian mainland set up more coastal air defense systems. Mobile missile carriers rushed onto coastal highways. The U.S. evacuated civilians from coastal areas, moving people into shelters. The tension was suffocating. A failed experiment had turned into a fierce retaliation, and the navies and air forces of both sides had stepped onto the battlefield, ready to turn the strait into an all-out inferno of war. The Bering Strait churned violently. From the west, the Russian naval formation cut through the waves like a steel wall. The carrier Admiral Kuznetsov led the way, flanked by a screen of Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates, heavy cruisers, and amphibious ships. Behind them, logistical ships stretched out like a chain, continuously pumping fuel and ammunition. From the east, the American fleet appeared. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Independence-class LCS littoral combat ships sped forward, small but maneuverable. Behind them, Virginia-class nuclear submarines hid beneath the blue waves, silent but deadly. Coastal batteries on the forward islands swiveled their barrels, aiming directly at the enemy formation. There was no turning back. Radar on both sides locked targets. Alarms blared across every ship deck. The first volley of missiles launched from an American destroyer. The streaks of light flew skimming the waves, heading straight for a Russian frigate. The other side reacted. The domestic air defense system fired interceptors. Fireballs erupted in midair. A few were shot down, but several missiles got through, exploding against the ship's side, throwing up a column of water that engulfed the vessel. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Independence-class LCS littoral combat ships sped forward, small but maneuverable. Behind them, Virginia-class nuclear submarines hid beneath the blue waves, silent but deadly. Coastal batteries on the forward islands swiveled their barrels, aiming directly at the enemy formation. There was no turning back. Radar on both sides locked targets. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Independence-class LCS littoral combat ships sped forward, small but maneuverable. Behind them, Virginia-class nuclear submarines hid beneath the blue waves, silent but deadly. Coastal batteries on the forward islands swiveled their barrels, aiming directly at the enemy formation. There was no turning back. Radar on both sides locked targets. In response, the Russian frigates launched a barrage of cruise missiles. A deafening roar, the sea lit up. The target was the lead American destroyer. One hit true, turning the ship into a smoking hulk. Sailors leaped into the sea to escape. The underwater explosion caused the massive ship to shudder its steel hull, splitting open, sailors panicking and jumping overboard. But the Russian firepower was overwhelming. The Chukotka coastal missile batteries opened up and support ballistic missiles, raining down on the sea, creating immense pressure. American coastal batteries returned fire, but their limited range couldn't cover the entire area. Both sides threw everything they had at each other. The U.S. fought back stubbornly, but Russia had the advantage in numbers and continuous resupply from the mainland. American admirals gave the order to pull back the formation, fighting as they retreated, trying to hold the defensive line close to the coast. The smaller, maneuverable American ships continued to weave and fire, trying to buy time, while the larger ships took heavy losses. The strait was now nothing less than a giant steel forge. On the surface, the burning wreckage of ships drifted. On the coast of Chukotka, Russia initiated a large-scale weapons test. On the coastal launchers, the newest Zircon missiles were raised, their warheads gleaming. Radar tracking systems and specialized vehicles crowded the test site. This was a demonstration intended to prove the strength of Moscow's military technology. The first enormous missile ignited, roaring into the sky, leaving a bright red trail of fire. Tracking radar showed a stable flight path. The Russian side maintained its overwhelming assault. The Chukotka coastal launchers fired relentlessly. Ballistic missiles and anti-ship missiles tore through the sky, falling around the American naval formation. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers were hit repeatedly. Their hulls breached flames, shooting from their engine rooms. Many sailors, unable to escape, were consumed by the inferno. In the air, the advantage also leaned toward Russia. Squadrons of Su-57 seconds and Su-35 seconds lurked, picking off American F-22 Raptors and F-16 seconds one by one. Long black smoke trails cut the sky like knives. Planes plunged into the sea, creating massive splashes, their airframes disintegrating. Dewey Mart B and American submarines tried to use torpedoes to stop the advance. A direct hit on a Russian amphibious ship broke it in two, leaving a massive oil slick as it sank. On the coast of Chukotka, Russia initiated a large-scale weapons test. On the coastal launchers, the newest Zircon missiles were raised, their warheads gleaming. Radar tracking systems and specialized vehicles crowded the test site. This was a demonstration intended to prove the strength of Moscow's military technology. The first enormous missile ignited, roaring into the sky, leaving a bright red trail of fire. Tracking radar showed a stable flight path, but the number of enemy ships was too great. The small American force was overwhelmed. American coastal artillery fired furiously. Volleys of 155mm M777 howitzer shells flew, landing in the water between the Russian ships, creating massive splashes, but their firepower wasn't enough to stop the advancing steel tide. In the outskirts of the port of Anchorage, columns of smoke rose as a volley of anti-ship missiles from the Russian side struck the container terminal, the shockwave expanding. Massive cranes toppled containers, falling into the water like scrap metal. The strategic port city was engulfed in flames. The U.S. began pulling back its formation. The remaining ships tried to cluster near the coast to use the cover from coastal artillery and air defense systems. But retreating meant ceding the sea to the Russian fleet. The entire front line collapsed back toward the mainland. The situation hung by a thread. The sea was littered with burning wreckage, the spreading oil creating a black smoking film, the stench of burning filling the air. In the sky, the constant flashing of missile explosions created an apocalyptic scene. In the deep torpedo detonations, through columns of white foam dozens of meters high, swallowing any ship caught in the blast. Russia pressed its advance, but was also taking losses. 2 frigates were damaged, and several Su-33 fighters had fallen. However, with their numerical superiority and continuous resupply from the mainland, the overall advantage still lay firmly with Moscow. The battle wasn't over, but the outcome was clear. The U.S. was pinned against its own coast, its defensive line in danger of breaking. With one more decisive push, the entire fleet could be crushed right at the mainland's doorstep. The sky over the Bering Strait was ablaze with explosions. The sea was scarred with burning oil and drifting wreckage, white plumes erupting as torpedoes detonated. American forces were pushed against their coast, their destroyers huddled in a small defensive circle. The Russian side pressed closer, its frigates and aircraft carrier closing within range of the coastal artillery. Just as the balance seemed to tip decisively in Russia's favor, battlefield radar suddenly registered new signals. From the east, from the edge of the Pacific, a series of bright dots sped toward the battle. At first, they were just small blips, then the sky thundered with the sound of jet engines. The U.S. began pulling back its formation. The remaining ships tried to cluster near the coast to use the cover from coastal artillery and air defense systems. But retreating meant ceding the sea to the Russian fleet. The entire front line collapsed back toward the mainland. The situation hung by a thread. The sea was littered with burning wreckage, the spreading oil creating a black smoking film, the stench of burning filling the air. Massive explosions sent fireballs hundreds of meters into the air, the ship's hulls were breached, and they sank quickly in the inferno. Immediately after a flight of F divided by A, 18Es flew low-dropping bunker-buster bombs on the approaching amphibious ships. The bombs tore through the decks, fire erupting from the holds, black smoke billowing like a volcano. Russian sailors scrambled for their lives in the chaos. The carrier Admiral Kuznetsov reacted, launching Su 33 seconds into the air. But high above the American F, 35 seconds already had an advantage. The American pilots unleashed air-to-air missiles, turning the sky into a dense pattern of fire. Two Su 33 seconds burst into flames and dove toward the sea, leaving long black trails. The sea vibrated with chain reaction explosions. Harpoon missiles from distant American submarines joined the fight, targeting the escorting frigates. The missiles flew low, skimming the water, striking the ship's sides and creating tower-like splashes. One ship was torn in two, its hull reduced to floating debris, the shockwave rattling the area. Russian officers were horrified to see their front line penetrated. Radar reported ship after ship losing contact. The formation was shattered. From the American carriers, pilots continued to launch. The F-35 seconds flew in V formations, cutting through the smoke-filled red sky, their afterburners drowning out the sound of anti-aircraft fire below. Every time they dove, the sea flashed with another violent explosion. The beleaguered American forces on the coast seized the opportunity to counterattack. Small LCS ships weaved through the waves, firing naval strike missiles NSM at targets already scattered by the US strike. The tide was beginning to turn. The scene in the strait was a steel furnace. In the sky, fighters streaked, leaving white trails. On the sea, ships burned bright red-black smoke covering the horizon. Explosions were ceaseless, each one a hammer blow on the water's surface. The sudden appearance of the US mainland forces had changed the battlefield. Russia, once the aggressor, was now on the defensive, but the power balance wasn't settled because on the mainland, a series of Russian coastal air defense batteries were opening their hatches ready to fire back. The war was about to enter a new crescendo. The Chukotka coast shook. Dozens of S-400 Triumph air defense batteries opened their hatches simultaneously, missiles nearly 10 meters tall pointing skyward. The sky lit up as volleys launched, leaving twisting white smoke trails. The guided missiles shot straight toward the American fighter squadrons. This was no slow-paced fight. An entire forest of anti-aircraft fire had been prepared and was now unleashed. On the radar screens, hundreds of bright streaks overlapped, turning the sky into a deadly matrix. F-35 seconds and F-18 seconds immediately took evasive action. They dove low, banking hard to dodge, but the number of missiles was too great. One struck the wing of a Super Hornet. It burst into a fireball and plunged into the sea, the pilot unable to eject. Moments later, another F-35 was hit in the tail. The airframe spun wildly before disappearing into black smoke. Deep inland long-range radar continued to scan, calling in more aircraft. Squadrons of Su-35 seconds and Su-57 seconds appeared in the western sky. The concrete airbases in Chukotka vibrated as jet after jet took off, forming a dense formation. The sky became a massive battlefield. Hundreds of planes streaked, leaving contrails. Air-to-air missiles exploded, constantly flashes of light wreckage raining down into the sea like metal. On the water, the Russian fleet also reacted fiercely. The Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates and cruisers launched volleys of anti-ship missiles, skimming the waves heading for the American destroyers. One ship was hit, fire erupting from its engine room hull breached, sinking amidst desperate cries for help. The Kuznetsov roared Su-33 seconds, launching to join the dogfight with American F, divided by A-18 seconds. The sound of jets was deafening. American AIM 120 missiles met Russian long-range air-to-air missiles, exploding in mid-air, scattering sparks. Beneath the sea, Russian submarines joined the fight. Heavy torpedoes were fired, striking a maneuvering American submarine. The underwater explosion created a massive column of white foam, the sea shaking violently. Nearby ships shuddered. The entire region became a hailstorm of ordnance. The US side tried to hold its ground, but the fire from the Russian mainland was relentless. The initial American advantage quickly eroded as one by one planes and ships were taken out. On the Alaskan coast, anti-aircraft guns fired, but not enough to provide cover. The port of Anchorage shook violently as it was hit by a crossfire of Russian missiles. Containers, cranes, and fuel depots exploded, black smoke enveloping the port city. The tide turned again. With the home field advantage, Russia fought while being constantly resupplied ammunition fuel reserve aircraft. Meanwhile, the American carrier groups were far offshore. Their fighters had limited fuel and were forced to return for refueling, leaving a gap in the battle. The sun hung over the Red Sea, but its light was obscured by the constant flashes of explosions. On the horizon, black smoke mingled with white clouds, creating a solid wall of haze. Burning ships listed burning planes plunged into the sea, creating an unprecedented, horrific spectacle. American AIM-120 missiles met Russian long-range air-to-air missiles, exploding in mid-air, scattering sparks. The sky was choked with smoke, the sea thick with the smell of cordite and burning oil. But amid the chaos, Russia gradually regained the initiative. From deep inland, convoys of ammunition and fuel streamed to the coast. New missile batteries were brought in to replace those that had emptied their tubes. Heavy transport planes landed at Chukotka bases, unloading fuel and munitions, which were immediately sent to the front. Conversely, the US-led coalition began to feel the logistical strain. American F, divided by A-18 seconds, and F-35 seconds, were forced to cycle back to distant carriers for fuel, a time-consuming process that left gaps in air cover. Pilots were exhausted, the pace of the attack faltering. The US forces in Alaska, with limited resources, were left with only small squadrons that were thrown into an overwhelming fight the moment they took off. At sea, the Russian fleet advanced like a steel wall. The Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates formed a line firing salvos of cruise missiles. The projectiles skimmed the waves like a school of sharks, forcing the American destroyers to maneuver constantly. A few smaller ships couldn't evade in time and were struck breaking apart in the water, leaving only a massive swirl. On the island shore, American defensive artillery roared, columns of dust rising as 155mm M777 howitzers, nya darn, but their range was limited, and they were suppressed by counter-battery fire from the mainland. One by one, the coastal artillery positions were bracketed, hit by missiles, and turned into blackened craters. In the air, the disparity was clear. Russian Su-35 seconds and Mi-G 31 seconds dominated the airspace, locking down the American F-16 seconds. The Su-57 seconds engaged in direct duels with American F-35 seconds. The furious dogfights created vortexes of smoke and fireplanes exploding and falling into the sea, leaving black streaks on the waves. The American pilots tried to keep up, but were overwhelmed by numbers and the enemy's rapid resupply. Russian planes could return to base, rearm, refuel, and be back in the fight in minutes. The sky was gradually filled with Russian fighters. The tactical map tilted. The red line of the Russian Navy pushed past the median line, advancing directly on the US coast. The blue line of the US forces contracted, squeezed against its own shore. In the command bunkers in Alaska, operators worked at full capacity. The electronic map flashed with red dots, indicating an increasing density of Russian ships and planes. Officers were tense, sweat beading, issuing orders to evacuate coastal civilians. In the cities, sirens wailed. Crowds hurried into underground shelters, their eyes filled with anxiety, the air thick with fear. On the battlefield, the situation was grimmer. The port of Anchorage was burning, black smoke billowing. Juneau shook from nearby impacts. Small ships were incinerated at their berths. American soldiers fought back bravely, but their ammunition was running out. Their gunfire grew sporadic, while the explosions from Russian artillery only became more frequent. The dimming sun reflected off a sea of red. The scenario was clear: the American defensive line was about to be breached, and the mainland response force couldn't turn the tide in time. But war wasn't just on these shores. To the northeast, battlefield radar registered new signals. Other formations of ships and planes were entering the fray. This force didn't belong to the US or Russia. A new variable was about to appear, and would it change the outcome? The sky over the strait was choked with smoke, the explosions still thundering. Russia had the clear advantage, its fleet was close, its fighters dominated the sky, its coastal defenses fired relentlessly. The American coalition was cornered, its line about to break. But just as the tactical map was about to be painted red, US radar picked up strange signals. From the northeast, dozens of new bright dots appeared, fast in dense formation. The sky shook with the sound of new jet engines. It was a squadron of F-15EX Strike Eagles and carrier-based F-35Cs. They arrived. But in the command center of the carrier, Admiral Kuznetsov, Russian admirals gripped the tactical map. The losses were clear, the fleet was being cornered. And when pushed to the limit, Moscow would not stand idly by. A desperate decision was being prepared. The U.S. Navy also joined the battle. From a distance, Arleigh Burke-class destroyers launched Tomahawk missiles aimed directly at the coastal air defense batteries in Chukotka. The missiles flew high before diving, striking ammo depots and radar stations, creating a horrific series of secondary explosions. Fire and smoke erupted. Russia's radar screen was torn to shreds. Caught by surprise, the entire Russian command system faltered. The airspace was suddenly divided. On one side, the combined American forces coordinated. On the other, Russia stood alone. The Allied coordination quickly turned the tide. While one part of the U.S. force focused on capital ships, another part took out the air defenses, and a Virginia-class submarine launched torpedoes, hitting another destroyer. The underwater explosion created a massive column of white foam, the steel wreckage torn apart, debris flying. Russia responded furiously from the mainland. The S-400 batteries continued to launch missiles. Su-35 seconds and Su-57 seconds scrambled to intercept, trying to hold the sky, but the fire from four directions threw them into disarray. Radar was overloaded, information was contradictory, commands were delayed. The once dense fleet now had dangerous gaps. The sea was red with fire, sinking ships, burning ships, falling planes, ceaseless explosions, black smoke twisting on the horizon. In this scene, the American flag flew on the tactical display. The coalition coordinated perfectly, each strike hitting a new vulnerability in Russia's massive defense system. The American people watched on live television, holding their breath, then bursting into cheers as they saw the enemy fleet beaten back. Cheers erupted in the bomb shelter's eyes, shining through the dust. The balance of power had shifted again, and this time, Russia was being repulsed. But in the command center of the carrier, Admiral Kuznetsov, Russian admirals gripped the tactical map. The losses were clear, the fleet was being cornered. And when pushed to the limit, Moscow would not stand idly by. A desperate decision was being prepared. Russian admirals ordered an all-out counterattack. Every remaining warship was mobilized, their 130mm cannons roaring. The destroyers fired their remaining cruise missiles, turning the sea into a grid of death. From the mainland, hundreds of rounds from Bastion P coastal launchers were Haihua A steel rain Swung Vungbien, Dangup To Lin Kun. The sea shook. An American destroyer was hit and sank. Another U.S. destroyer took a hit and caught fire, but continued to fire back. The coalition was paying a heavy price for every advance. In the air, dozens of Su-57 seconds Lao Vau Turn Kui Kum. They dove, firing all their long-range air-to-air missiles at the American F-35 seconds and F, divided by A-18 seconds. The sky was thick with white contrails, missiles exploding in fierce flashes. Planes from both sides exploded, metal raining down. But numerical superiority and firepower weren't enough to change the situation. The coalition, despite its losses, maintained the encirclement. U.S. ships hit the flanks and focused on destroying capital ships, while the Alaskan forces secured the coast. The Russian fleet was pushed back, pinned against its own Chukotka coastline. In the command bunker in Moscow, the screens were full of red dots losing signal. The generals were silent, the only sound the frantic comms chatter. The reality was stark, Russia was losing and losing control. In this desperate situation, one final option was put on the table. Strategic missile units were put on nuclear alert. In deep underground silos, the launch covers of intercontinental ballistic missiles carrying nuclear warheads began to slide open. This information was leaked via U.S. spy satellites, instantly relayed to Allied command. No official declaration was needed. The signs were clear. Russia was preparing to use the final option. A global warning was issued. International media ran the headlines. The specter of nuclear war hangs over the Pacific. On the battlefield, Allied commanders were ordered to halt their advance. U.S. ships held their positions. In the air, squadrons were called back to a defensive line, avoiding further provocation. Both sides still exchanged sporadic fire, but the intensity had dropped. An eerie silence fell after a hellish day of fire. The air still stank of cordite, the sea was still littered with wreckage, but the violent roar had subsided. In its place was the sound of nuclear alert sirens wailing from Tokyo, Seoul, and Washington, D.C., Russia, had been backed into a corner. And now, rather than accept defeat, they raised the most terrifying specter of all nuclear weapons, threatening the entire world. The last sunlight stretched across the sea of fire. The battle had paused, not for peace, but because a larger shadow, the shadow of nuclear war, had fallen. Deep in the Russian interior, the ICBM launch doors were open. Satellite imagery confirmed the massive launchers were ready. The nuclear warheads could reach any target within thousands of kilometers, including the US, Japan, and South Korea. The news spread like lightning to Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul. Red alert was declared. Patriot and THAAD nuclear defense systems were activated. E-3 Sentry AWACS planes circled. Long-range radar was at maximum power. Not a single shot was fired, but the world held its breath. In the shelters in Alaska, people held their children whispering prayers. In Seoul and Tokyo, the streets were empty. Only the sound of warning sirens over loudspeakers. On social media, millions debated in fear. Is nuclear war about to happen? The US, Japan, Korea coalition immediately halted all offensive operations. The fleets held their positions, planes circled outside the engagement zone. No unit crossed the line near the Chukotka coast. They understood that one more provocation could be the trigger. Russia, in its desperation, had played its final card, but it backfired. The international media exploded. From the United Nations to European capitals, the criticism was deafening. Moscow was using nuclear blackmail to threaten global security. A major New York newspaper ran the headline, "Loser deploys doomsday weapon." In London, Paris, and Berlin, thousands took to the streets in protest, demanding an end to this reckless act. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the truth was obvious. Russia suffered the heaviest losses. More importantly, they had forced Russia into a humiliating retreat, left with nothing but nuclear threats. The last light faded into the black smoke billowing from the sea. The battle ended not with a clear victory, but with a terrifying silence. The fleet's pulled back planes returned to base. Neither side fired another shot. Everyone waited, knowing one mistake could plunge the region into a nuclear holocaust. On international television, Russia's image was defined by harsh criticism: cowardly, impotent, dangerous. They understood that one more provocation could be the trigger. Russia, in its desperation, had played its final card, but it backfired. Russia was the most heavily damaged, its reputation destroyed. While the world was left to face a terrifying reality, nuclear war could break out.